Hello, my name's Amanda Bradley, and I teach English and Creative Writing at Keystone. I'm also a member of Team G. I'm here today to introduce you to Jennifer Michael Hecht. I met Jennifer Michael Hecht in the fall of 2010 when I took her poetry literature seminar at the New School in Manhattan. I went into class wowed by her resume. A PhD in the history of science and European cultural history from Columbia University, 2 well-received books of poems, The Next Ancient World and Funny, works of prose that examine intellectual and cultural history, such as The End of the Soul, Scientific Modernity, Atheism and Anthropology, also The Happiness Myth, and the book for sale here today, Doubt, A History. Jennifer has since built on that resume with Stay, A History of Suicide and the Arguments Against It, and the fun and inspired poetry book, Who Said? But I walked away from that class at the New School even more impressed. Jennifer's ease, her level of comfort in the world of ideas in which she has achieved such high mastery, made her approachable. Much like her poetry itself, she proved intense, philosophical, intellectual, thought-provoking, but also accessible. That's a neat trick, a rare attribute. She can and does translate the vast body of knowledge in her mind in ways that have a genuine impact on readers and listeners. In that class, Jennifer told us not to be afraid to say something meaningful in our poems, something she achieves in spades in her own poems. This is a writer and thinker who likes to impact people. A defender of atheism, humanism, and community, Jennifer is currently working on a book called The Wonder Paradox. She's here to join our discussion on finding the better angels of our nature with a discussion of what's been on her mind lately. Please help me welcome Jennifer Michael Hecht.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. I've had a wonderful time so far here, and thanks for inviting me. Thank you so much for that introduction, too. It was lovely. So I'm a poet and intellectual historian, sometimes called a historian of ideas. As Amanda said, I have poetry books, and I've taught poetry, but I'm also a historian. My PhD's in history, in the history of science, and in cultural history. And today's talk is about fun with the interfaithless, a word I made up and use because it makes me laugh and because it highlights what people who don't believe or believe less than they were raised to believe have in common. The interfaith movement brought together people from other faiths to see each other as the same. And the idea of an interfaithless is the idea of looking not just at what we reject, but what we're left with. Starting with a 2012 Pew study, we found that a full fifth of people in the United States identify as a none, no religion, where they put down they have no religion. That's around 50 million people. And in the people under 30, it's a full third who identify as having no religion. Now, not all of those are atheists, and not all atheists don't practice any religion. Of course, it's a group that is very varied all over the country and in lots of different ways. Nevertheless, they have a tremendous amount in common that we haven't been looking at. And I think we have to look at what we have in common with religious people, what we can have in common with religious people, and also what we have in common with each other. The idea of not believing in religion and therefore just not having anything to do with that whole category is really problematic. A lot of leading secularists are against religion. They hate religion. And that is, that's sometimes because leading secularists are first generation not believers. So they're angry at religion. Maybe they were taught something that they didn't believe, or maybe they were beaten with the Bible. I hear from a lot of those people. So they're very aggressively, they want people to know that they're against religion, that they don't believe. I don't feel that way. I feel, well, I joke that I was raised an atriist, a Long Island anti-arboreal coven, where we couldn't have a Christmas tree because we were Jewish. We did practice. My father's a physicist and didn't believe. My mother did believe, but they were both raised Jewish, and so we did practice in that way. But the idea that because we don't believe in a specific description of a God, a being, an afterlife, things like this, it gets assumed that we're just science, we're just reason. But we are not just science, and we are not just reason. Life is absurd. It is bizarre. It doesn't really get remembered in chronological order. It's a very transcendent experience on the inner level. But how do you talk about it outside religion? Well, poetry is one of the big answers, and art in general. Poetry is excellent for it because it does speak language. We use language, so I can communicate ideas with it, but I don't have to stick to any rules, even grammar. I can go right to the edge of intelligibility to try to express feeling and experience. The idea that life is full of paradox can be, that is, I think religion was invented to highlight the way that the human experience is full of paradox. The first huge paradox is consciousness itself. The meat thinks. It's flesh. Flesh and blood came up with Beethoven's symphonies and all the Shakespeare. The idea that the meat thinks is strange. We are all these beings stuck in our heads with some similarities, trying to reach out to each other. But if you think about consciousness, just the fact of it, that all this thought emanates from these fleshy beings, which evolved basically just to stay alive and keep repeating. I mean, consciousness is a lot weirder than virgin birth. I mean, virgin birth doesn't happen, but I can imagine how it could, right? The egg could just start splitting on its own. It's imaginable. But how does consciousness come out of flesh? It's amazing. Along with that paradox is the paradox of time and space and mattering. We matter. The universe is huge. There are hundreds of billions of galaxies, hundreds of billions of galaxies. And in galaxies, in large ones, there are trillions of stars. We are in an average size galaxy, the Milky Way, and we are in one little star, in one of its little spiral wings, sort of out on the edge. And then even down on our planet, there are 7 billion of us. These facts tend to make us feel that we don't matter. The universe is so huge. And time does the same thing. The dinosaurs were around for 175 million years, and they started disappearing 75 million years ago. Human beings have been around 200,000. Agriculture goes back around 10,000 years, and writing comes out of agriculture, the need to keep notes. First, we made up symbols. Then, as we started to specialize a little bit, we needed symbols to trade, because the corn doesn't come in at the same time as I want you to trade me the cow, so we have to make notes. And that's when we come up with calendars and time and all sorts of things in order to facilitate agricultural life. So all of history, everything we have written down, we're talking about 10,000 years, and in most cases, much, much less. And if you even look within history, 3,000 years the Egyptian civilization went on. That's century after century of change. You can even go into our time, the space between Ovid and the Venerable Bede, an early medieval or even pre-medieval philosopher, 600 years. You know, Ovid's a late Empire Roman poet. Think about what 600 years means to us going back or going forward. 600 years. Now, all those people in all those cultures all over the world felt as important as we feel, right? They knew they were real. They had goals. They had a whole world. And somehow their disappearance and the hugeness of time and space seems to make us not matter. But in comparison to everything I've told you just now, you still matter more than the universe in a lot of ways, right? You're on a profound level more interested in living through the day, in your lives. We know we matter. We matter to each other. It seems bizarre. If you put 7 billion basketballs on a table and one fell off, it wouldn't matter. But if they're human beings, it matters, because he had a daughter, because he was real to himself. We feel mattering and meaning. A lot of non-theists or differently theist people think that if we lose religion, we lose meaning. This is all just science. This is all just material. But that's not how it feels, is it? And we live inside how it feels. The formula I use is that the feeling of meaning is sufficient to the definition of meaning, just as the feeling of love is sufficient to the definition of love. Love isn't out there. I can't measure it just like a rock. But I know it's there, and I know I'm not inventing it. I'm not making it up. I may be making up my portion of love, but if I deny love, it doesn't mean that nobody else loves anybody. And it doesn't mean that I'm not going to love people later. And we know that in our culture, right? We don't say it doesn't exist. Well, meaning exists too, and for the same reasons. We feel it. We don't feel it all the time, just as we don't always feel love. And we don't have to be generating meaning on our own all the time. We live in a robust culture, a historical culture, and within that we find all sorts of purpose and meaning so that it is outside of us as well as inside of us. Over 100 years ago, the first sociologist, Durkheim, in France, said that when people get together in a large group for prayer or for other spiritual kind of meetings, he said they feel God and they're right to feel something bigger than themselves. He didn't believe in God. And he said what they're feeling is something that can only be generated by community when we're together. So that's another paradox. Consciousness is a paradox. The idea of time and space, we can define paradox as it's a statement with an and yet. Two sides are right, they seem to prove each other wrong, and yet neither disappears, right? The universe is huge and in some ways so bigger than us that we are as ants, right? But it's also true that to ourselves and to each other, we're more important than that science mumbo jumbo. It's us, we're the ones we care about. Both things remain true even though they contradict each other and sit right next to each other. And consciousness is bizarre in that way. And so is the fact that when we get together, we feel so much, we care about each other, and culture is bigger than us, and we can lean into it. Another paradox, the last one I'll give you for now, is the paradox of the smart body, right? Our brains are doing all this thinking, but if you left me alone in a laboratory with all the materials I wanted for 100 years, I would not be able to invent the human eye. Yet my dumb body did it twice. I have 2 children. That's extraordinary. We are participants in things that are way beyond our knowledge. And no matter what you believe in, you have to respect that there is, even just that our bodies, that we can make a person that way. That is bizarre, it is paradoxical, it is strange. And forgetting about the bizarre and paradoxical and strange is to forget about one of the greatest parts of our humanity, of what it is to be a person. I got into this subject, I'll quickly give you a little bit of background, that I was at Columbia doing my PhD, and I just sort of fell in with the historians of science. I thought I would do a sort of history of poetry, but I found the historians of science fascinating. And what history of science does is sort of try to figure out how culture influences science. You can say that the philosophy of science is how science works, and the history of science is how science doesn't work. One of the big themes that I was first writing about was anthropology, because in the 19th century, we invent anthropology as a discipline, and that's also the period that peoples all over the world are mixing together, and people of Europe and the United States are trying to make sense of all of this, and they start classifying people. Some people in the 19th century were already against this, were already argued against physical anthropology in that way. But a lot of people were using physical anthropology to prove that other people's women and children were like animals, and animals were like them, to try to rate everyone and to keep them in their box. The anthropologists that I was studying, and I did write a lot about race and how some of these ideas came about and how they've been dismantled in the past, because they have been. We've had good people arguing against this stuff sort of all along. But I found this group of people who had, a group of anthropologists who had formed the Society of Mutual Autopsy. They pledged to dissect each other after death, with the idea of, especially each other's brains, that's what they really did, with the idea that they would be able to match personality traits, abilities, intelligence with brain morphology. Paul Broca, in the middle of the 19th century, found the first relationship between what the brain morphology and a personality trait. And we still call the third left frontal convolution of the brain Broca's area. Doctors still call it Broca's area. It's the speech area. He had known a man who could only say a sort of syllable over and over, and he dissected his brain after death. This was before the Society of Mutual Autopsy. This is what gave them the idea. And found that he had a lesion on this area, and it proved to be consistent. Now, these anthropologists, they were anthropologists only because they called themselves anthropologists. They started the first school of anthropology. The idea that they had was that they were going to be able to map the whole brain. Didn't turn out that way. They autopsied each other as they died, and hundreds of people joined the Society of Mutual Autopsy all over France. And because they were trying to match brain morphology with personality, they had people who joined the club and paid dues every year, so it wasn't even just a fly-by-night thing. They needed to know the people's personalities and abilities and traits in order to compare it to the brain that came in. So I found all these papers in the basement of the Museum of Musée de l'Homme, in the bottom of the Trocadero, underneath the Eiffel Tower. Down this spiral, dusty, dark staircase. They gave me a flashlight, and I went down there, and I found these papers. Had to dress in brown every day because they were 19th century papers disintegrate all over you and you're a mess. But yeah, I was able to read these testimonies and these 19th and early 20th century French people saying why they don't believe in religion and why they want their brains dissected. Because they said their goal was to find out about brains, but their other articulated goal was to prove to the Catholic Church that the soul doesn't exist. And they actually kind of succeeded because the Catholic Church, which is dominant in France, where they were, believed at the time that the soul did the thinking and it just sat in the brain. And these anthropologists did get people to stop saying that, to find a different way of describing soul. But for them, they said, look, we don't need a soul anymore because the meat really does think. We know it does because we can match areas of the brain to abilities. Like I said, religion just changes when it's pushed in certain directions, and religion went on. But they didn't know that, and in a way, their work helped to get church and state separated in 1905 in France. And that's when the Society of Mutual Autopsy declined. But studying the Society of Mutual Autopsy and studying their background, I found that there was no good history of irreligion, history of doubt, history of atheism, but also history of people, of doubt in philosophy, of knowing what we can know. Can we know anything? I mean, think about it. We're these tiny little blobs of flesh with only two eyes in the front. I mean, every evolutionary story that I hear, you know, why don't we have one in the back? That would make a lot of sense. But the idea that we would have enough information to be able to know the world fully is bizarre. But the paradox of awe and wonder, the fact that we are flesh and can and feel all this wonder, is a paradox that overarches all of these things. So when I found that there was no good history of doubt or atheism, the problem was there were some good short ones, but for the most part, they were too polemic. The religious people argued that there's never been atheists. It's always just been a curse people say to each other. And the atheists, I'm sorry to say, also fudged the data a little bit. They would, you know, take quotes from people that looked atheist. And then when I would go back and read the book, sometimes no. I wanted to know the truth. I wasn't involved in the cultural wars. It was before the new atheists had come out. I just wanted the story. I knew that there was a history of atheism. I knew from the ancient Greeks. I knew from the underground Renaissance writers. I did think before I wrote the book that there would be a period of darkness in the Dark Ages, a sort of this be dragons. There were none. But no, I found atheists then too. So the earliest atheists I found were the Ancient Carvaka. This is the earliest well-spelled out atheism. Because even in the Psalms, look at them, it's the godless this and the godless that. And it's really only religious interpretation that has made us think, oh, that's not really godless. Well, the words are there. The godless this and the godless that. There were people who didn't believe. There were certainly people who didn't believe in the afterlife. I mean, when Job was written, there was no afterlife. Jewish people hadn't invented it, and the Hellenistic people hadn't invented it yet, and that's where it comes out of. We do see an afterlife for pharaohs in ancient Egypt, but not for everybody else, until the very latest period when the rich could sort of buy in. But throughout most of history, most people have not believed in an afterlife. Confucianism is not a God religion or an afterlife religion. You respect your ancestors, but it's really much more a moral system of respecting those above you and the duty you owe to those below you. Theravada Buddhism doesn't have an afterlife. The entire East is trying to get out of life, right? That's the goal, to pop out of existence with nirvana. So we here have a skewed view of things. We think of monotheism as an endpoint, as a place we were all going and getting to. And we think, oh, everyone has always hated the idea of death to the point that they made up a different story. But it's not true. people who haven't thought of an afterlife. And you see in Ecclesiastes, which was written about 300 years after Job, you see the afterlife mentioned, but Koheleth, the preacher who wrote, that's what he's called, and so that's all we have for him. Koheleth means the preacher, who wrote Ecclesiastes. He says, dust to dust. Why does not a man die like a dog? Everything goes back to the earth. So he had heard of the afterlife, but didn't believe it. So we can chart this pretty regularly. So, like I said, the earliest I found that was really spelled out atheism and rationalism, and even what you might call scientism in a way, of saying nature is sufficient, is the Ancient Carvaka, 600 BC, before the Buddha. We believe the Buddha was influenced by them. And the Carvaka rejected the Hinduism that was already there, one of the oldest religions, the oldest, really, the Vedic tradition. And so the Carvaka said if there were souls without bodies, there would be mangoes hanging in the air without mango trees. But there aren't. The Carvaka said if you really believed that burning your loved ones at a funeral pyre, burning your parents sends them to some special process, why not burn them now? Why wait till they die? They said every argument that we hear, they said nature is sufficient. Look how it generates itself with patterns, repeating on patterns. They said humanity is enough, that the magic is in us. They said the preachers were there to make money, and the priests were there to keep the government strong by getting the people to believe. And the Carvaka was strong and went on for centuries and centuries. And mostly what we have of them was collected in polemics against them. So the Muslims especially burned all the Carvaka stuff, but they had written tomes against them and collected the Carvaka's works in there so that they could criticize them. And that's what we have. And with the history of doubt, that's a lot of the places that I got this kind of information. It's really fascinating. A lot of societies, the priests are sort of on a noble level, certainly on a notable level, and the high priests are living very well, which means their children get very well educated, and they're the ones who rebel. So we have their material too. There's all sorts of sneaky ways that also heresy trials. We've just, in the last 20 years, been translating heresy trials and realizing it's not all people saying, I believe something else. There's a lot of people saying things like, the plague killed my whole family. No father would treat babies like that. I don't believe. You know, with no other influence, they said, I can't accept that on a sort of moral grounds. Other people have just believed in nature. And we find these people talking to each other century after century. In what I thought was going to be the Dark Ages, the Islamic world was having a golden age. And what was going on there? Full-on doubt, full-on atheism. There were even priests who were full-on atheism, but mostly doctors. That happens all over the world. Doctors are science-minded, but they're also beloved. And in the ancient world and the medieval world, they're rare. And the ones who were great sort of martyrs of their time, taking care of people, were allowed to say an awful lot. And this was true in the Islamic world too. When Rome collapses, it collapses to the east. So the new capital is Constantinople, because that's where all the money was. There was nothing in France and England. Julius Caesar just took that because there was nothing left to conquer. You know, the Romans brought the wealth that was in that area, and when Rome starts to fall, it contracts away from there, and everything goes back to ruin there. But the money is in the east. So all the ancient world's philosophy, materialist philosophy, the ideas of thinking about what is life, who are we, how does all this work, all the Plato and Aristotle, Xenophanes said if cows and oxen could speak, they would tell us that their gods are cows and oxen. The ancient world, a meteorite fell, and they said, it's a hot rock. Maybe those are hot rocks up there too. The first chapter of Doubt is called Whatever Happened to Zeus and Hera. And by the time you get to Plato, who's really at the end of the great civilization of the ancient world, he says all the youth are atheists today. It was in the ancient world that atheism became, that is, in the ancient world, they made up a law against atheism because there was an atheist they couldn't deal with and banished him. So there was a vibrant culture. There was also all these secular religions, the world of the Cynics, the world of the Epicureans. Epicurus believed that there was nothing to fear because when you're dead, you won't know it, and don't fear the gods because they're not real. He believed that we got the idea from somewhere. Everyone he knew, the world believed in it the same way our world believes in a sort of Judeo-Christian world. So he thought maybe people saw the gods in dreams because he was the first one to come up with, well, not the first, but one of the first popularized the idea that there were other worlds out there. And he thought the gods were just these sort of atoms that sort of shimmered in these shapes, and they were happy. That's their only attribute. They don't know we're here. They didn't make us. They just solved the problem of mood. That's it. And so they're worth contemplating for that. But he said they cause more fear than help, and they're not there, so don't worry about it. And that school of thought went on for hundreds of years. He had the Epicurean garden where people came to. Epicurean is now thought of as loving food, but he thought bread and water was better with a good friend than a fancy meal. But he did think the human stuff, eating with friends, is the most sacred human thing. And there were women, we know there were women who came to the garden too to talk about philosophy. And we know in the ancient world there were women who were atheists. Job's wife, by the way, is the first one who says, forget it, curse God and die. This is over. And it's hard to find the women in the history of atheism and the history of doubt because they don't get written down as much. But if you look for it, you see their skirts just disappearing behind the corner. They're there, and they're raising the next generation of atheists. And that was the most wonderful thing I discovered with doubt, that atheists and doubters, because remember, it's not atheism if there was no gods in their culture, but if they doubt karma, they doubt rebirth, they doubt an afterlife, whatever their home religion is in my book Doubt, to see how it changes. A lot of religious people love the book too because it shows how doubt presses on religion such that some people end up atheists and other people end up a different religion, right? They shift whatever was not working culturally. And so it's the story of how religion, Buddhism started in India and then disappeared from it, and it took on a whole new life in all the Asian countries. So, writing Doubt and being invited all over the country and abroad to talk about it made me aware of all sorts of different people's needs, people missing mystery and feeling like when they don't believe in the religion they were raised in anymore and they don't want a different religion, they feel bereft, they feel left out of holidays, left out of so much, and they have ways of talking to themselves to feel better about death, like the molecules all go back and we're stardust, but it's a little hard. The discovery that the atheists knew each other, named their children after other atheists. Voltairine de Cleyre was born, she became a famous atheist, but her father named her Voltairine because he loved Voltaire, but she didn't know that until much later. There were no good schools around. They sent her to a Catholic school, and she came to atheism on her own. The United States in the 19th century was full of women and men who made their lives as itinerant speakers because there was no internet. And there was no TV, and there was no radio. And what do you do if you want some intellectual stimulation? So town halls were all about lectures. People came into town and gave lectures. A lot of times the women were only allowed to address women, but they would have these full audiences. They did sometimes, some of them, Ernestine Rose got in trouble sometimes for talking atheism, but also socialism and protection of the Indian. The Native Americans were so abused in this period, and it was the race crisis that people were thinking of. And it was the atheists and the secularists who were so much on their side, because the priests were going to the reservations and proselytizing and taking money. So it was insult to injury. But the point is that having written Doubt and gone around and talked about it, I sort of became a bit of an atheist priest. Right away, people started asking me very personal questions, and not personal to me, but I mean, right away. One of the first times I was signing books, a couple comes up to me, very pregnant, and they say, we're both atheists, we're both from traditional Jewish families, the baby's a boy, can we have a bris? They're asking me. Because I had just given a talk about the history of atheism and doubt and how to do in the world. When they said, can I ask a question? I thought it would be, about Aristotle. But the point was, and I said to them, Mazel Tov, go ahead. I said, look, if you want to do it for your family, go ahead. But I suggest you read some Whitman or some Dickinson, something that really makes you feel ready to be a parent, inspired to give a life to a new person, inspired by life, supported. And that was when it started, the idea that we who don't believe what we came from, or believe less, or are very science-minded, very rationalist-minded, we still have experiences of transcendence, whether or not they're induced by wild dancing or drugs or sex, or we don't have that many ways to get to ecstasy if you're outside of religion. Our culture's notion of religion, other than drugs and sex, is the kind of mystic withholding of food and praying all the time and isolating yourself to get to a transcendent state. But we know that most human beings, and I've talked to so many people, I get the sense that a lot of people have a moment where in their past they felt one with everyone. They lost the feeling of ego separateness, and they felt that that was the true reality. I've certainly had that experience in my life. You don't get it much, but you don't need it much. One can last a lifetime. As I mentioned to my workshop yesterday, I meet people who are believers because they saw a vision in 1972 at church camp, and never again. But one experience that feels transcendent, you can remember that, and people draw on it. So I started very quickly realizing that my audiences, especially when I was being invited to an atheist group, I was very often invited to churches and temples where they weren't very believy. They knew who I was. I wasn't advertising. They'd read the book or heard me on the radio and had asked me to come. And they liked the take on it. They liked the fact that I believe that human beings mostly need ritual, meditation, community, and awe, a chance to both enrich their sense of awe and to express their awe. We need ritual, meditation, which is usually solitary even when you're doing it in a group, but it can be solitary. We today need solitude and quiet desperately. You know, it used to be illegal not to go to church on Sunday. Illegal. People went. You didn't want to go sometimes, you didn't like the people sometimes, but being with other human beings helps us. Coming together is a tremendous step, even coming here. It's great to get out of the closet, but you also have to leave the house. We have to come together. We have to meet each other. We have to see ourselves reflected in each other. And we have to allow ourselves to feel the love that we feel for each other and the responsibility in a lot of ways. I don't know if humanity can save me or wants to, but at least I believe it exists. So I have a chance with it. And I'm happier with that. But the idea of having ritual, meditation, awe, and community seems to be something that some people who believe also need to talk about and think about, because they've fallen out of those things. But we today we're overly stimulated, right? So we need meditation time. And in the West, meditation has usually meant meditation on a text. Also in the East, more than we realize, because it was Zen Buddhism that colonized America. And and the version of Zen Buddhism that came here was sitting meditation. But there are lots of walking meditations, and there are lots of meditations on texts. And if you go to most ashrams, you're going to be chanting. Those words meant something to the first people who were chanting. So poetry, reading poetry, but indeed also other experiences of art, can be that meditation. I've come to believe that choosing a few poems, choosing one or two poems for different reasons and events, and repeating them, just as you would prayer, they get richer, they get deeper, they begin to sustain you. They come to mind when you need them before you realize you need them, like songs do for some people. But if you read poetry and become more familiar with it, when I'm feeling small, I hear Emily Dickinson in my head say, "I'm nobody, who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us, don't tell." So the poets themselves, when I went to look for secular poetry, I realized that most poetry, the body of our classics, are written by people who at least doubted very much. Because why else be a poet? There are religious poets, of course, but most of them haven't made it into the classical canon, because I guess they're relying an awful lot on the religious sentiments. But people who don't feel that religion gives them the answers have to generate answers themselves. And so, Dickinson was a famous recluse, but the first place she stopped going was church. As soon as the Congregationalist church she belonged to said everyone has to stand up and say they believe these things, she wrote to Higginson, her confidant, that all the rest of the people in the house worship the sun and call it father, but she doesn't. She doesn't believe. And so she stopped going. And then she stopped doing other things. She certainly has poems where she puzzles over the possibility of eternity, of the divine. And yet she also has poems that clearly reject it. There's a tiny one: "Faith is a fine invention when gentlemen can see, but microscopes are prudent in an emergency." Whitman says, "I believe materialism and I believe spiritualism." He doesn't say he believes in any religion, but he says, "I wholly believe in materialism and I wholly believe in," he contains multitudes, so he can. He says, do I contradict myself? So I contradict myself. I contain multitudes. The question that I'm addressing now in this new book, The Wonder Paradox, is each chapter starts with a question I was asked in groups like this, talking to all sorts of different groups of all sorts of different ages and backgrounds. And that first question, can I do ritual, or is it a kind of betrayal of what I really believe? And what I believe is that we were wrong when we thought ritual was there to please a God who was demanding it. Ritual was always there because it helps us live. It was always there because we can't say everything we feel, and sometimes you have to do it. You can't get very drunk thinking about vodka. You might be able to get a little drunk thinking about vodka, but you can't get very drunk. And doing matters in a lot of ways. We still get married. People, when atheism first started to be something that we could talk about in Western culture in the modern age, people thought, oh, they're going to stop doing marriage. Why would you have those rules? But it didn't happen. And we think about what a wedding looks like. The one thing that you have at almost all of them is the two families sort of zipper together walking down that aisle. When you, as the guest, come, they ask you, whose side are you on, right? So we start out separate, and then the parents bring the children to the altar, and then they step back, which is their new job, right? Step back, you're done. And people really take that to heart. It's an amazing thing that so much changes in one day. You get new parents. You met this person in a bar, and now you're flesh of their flesh. Like, what? But what happens at that wedding is the ritual acts out the union. We don't have to say it. We're scared to say it in some ways these days. We're scared to say this is forever. We're scared to say, and you're going to become biologically one through children, because not everyone has children now. Also, people get married later, and sometimes they can't. But a lot of people are choosing not to for environmentalist reasons as well as others. Well, of course, every time women are educated, the population goes, stabilizes. Because once we know once we can have another life, we always choose to have it as well. But we also still have children. They were worried about that, right? So this question of how can we who are not in a religious tradition, first my question was with these big rituals, how do we do weddings, birth celebrations, and funerals? And the answer is what people were already doing, adding secular poetry to the ritual that was already there. But sometimes they just skip the funeral nowadays because they feel that without religion, why bother? Well, there's a reason, because that too is acting something out. It's a rite of passage for the people who are mourning. A rite of passage is 1909 that we first see the term rite of passage, rites of passage. And it has this liminal idea that when we are in the rite of passage, we are neither here nor there. We are traveling from one version of ourselves to a new one, which is, I believe, one of the reasons why weddings take place in two venues and funerals take place in two venues. We physically move. We move to a new place. I'm sure you've all heard of people who skipped attendance at a funeral and were kind of more haunted. It was hard to believe the person was gone. It can be hard to believe the person was gone anyway. Our brains are set up that way. But I've also heard people say, well, I know I was at the funeral, so. Also weddings. If you go to the wedding, you believe in the couple and you have a little responsibility, or may feel a little responsibility, to be on the side of keeping them together, because you were there in this rite of passage where they turned from this to that. So it was first rites of passage that I started to think about. What did religion used to give us, and what do we need now? And I first started with just the idea of the text. Just look at weddings. It used to be ubiquitous for Paul's Corinthians idea of love is, love is not angry, love is not jealous, love is kind. I mean, had he met people? I don't know. But it's quite an extraordinary thing. Well, I looked it up, folks, and until around 1800, it wasn't translated as love. It was translated as charity. And the word charity, in that sense, meant love for your fellows. Not giving, love for your fellows. That's why Paul says, even if you were to give away all your riches but not have love, now it says love, then it said charity. And by charity, they mean even if you give away to the poor everything you have, but you don't love them as yourself, you don't have anything. If you read that speech thinking about how Christianity functions today, it's bizarre. It says, if you don't have love, it doesn't matter if you have faith, you have nothing. Well, that's because what he meant was Christian charity. He meant the phenomena of early Christianity, when people would come together and feel quite ecstatic. They had this new idea, and it was passionate, and they loved each other, and they took care of each other, as we do when we're in groups. I really don't think morality needs to change that much. What needs to change is who we consider human. That is, all over the world, people treat equals pretty well. It's just who's an equal. There are other changes. My last book is called Stay, A History of Suicide and the Arguments Against It. And it's a secular argument against suicide, which I needed to write because I had accidentally become an atheist priest. And suicide is an epidemic. The truth is, religion isn't prohibitive anymore. Religion used to save people's lives. They would write notes right through the Middle Ages, through the early modern period. We have records of the devil tried to get me to kill myself, and God was fighting the other way, and I got through the night. And then they live on, and they don't do it. A lot of suicide is impulsive. If you can get through that impulse, you might not do it ever again. And there are lots of studies about this. I won't go into the details of Stay, but I found that there were a lot of strong secular arguments. Most philosophers through history have argued against suicide. Camus argues against suicide, though he's the one we remember as saying, go ahead and do it if you want, it's your life. But he didn't. He said, the first line in his amazing book, The Myth of Sisyphus, is suicide is the first and only philosophical question. Before you get to ontology or eschatology, first decide whether to live. We have to ask ourselves that question because he didn't believe in God or religion, and so he felt it was up to each individual. I think that's a mistake. But he found that life is absurd, hurrah. He said in the end of the chapter on Sisyphus, we must imagine Sisyphus happy. The rock is his thing. And that he said he's most human in that moment when he's at the top and the rock has let go and is falling down. That moment of failure we all know. That agony of having to recollect yourself and start again, which is what life is, because life is change and humans don't like that very much. So with Stay, I came to it because I lost 2 poet friends to suicide within 2 years. The first one was a shock, and a mutual friend of ours wrote afterward to her posthumous book saying how shocked and troubled she was by it. And then, like I said, about a year and a half later, she took her life too. And I had been thinking, I'd written a poem, The No Hemlock Rock, which starts, don't kill yourself, and ends, I won't either. And in that poem, I said, if you poison yourself, you poison the well. If you shoot yourself, you break the biodome. You take people with you. I didn't realize how true that would be until I really did the research, and it is abundantly and robustly proven, over and over repeated, that the idea of suicide is communicable, contagious, all these different words, but the point is we do what we do. We do what other people like us do. And if you're sitting down with a bunch of people who are smoking and drinking, you're way more likely to just do it. If you're living in an area where people are heavier, you let yourself get heavier. If you're living in an area where people have 1 child, you have 1 child. If they have 3, you have 3. We are so individualistic since the Enlightenment, and yet we are a group animal, and we act the same. We follow each other a tremendous amount, and we can support each other. When I realized how sad I was at losing these 2 friends who I had been close with in graduate school, they were getting their PhD in the English department while I was getting mine in history, but we were poets, so we met at poetry events, and I hadn't been close to them in a long time. I'd seen them around town at gatherings and stuff, but when I realized how deeply pained I was from losing them, though we were no longer that close, I realized at some point that I must be of that value to other people. Maybe we don't notice how much we value other people until they do that. But if they do that, it hurts and it lasts. And so I was able to make a secular argument against suicide on two ideas. One is community, which means it sounds like it's pressure, right? I know you're miserable, but I'm saying you have to stay for other people because because other people are more likely to do it if you do it. And not just other people, people like you. It follows age, gender, and occupation. Any way that a person says, oh, that's like me. Oh, so when a cop gets a bad diagnosis, they take their life. You just file that, and it can lead to impulsive behavior when you're either inebriated or mostly humiliated. You know, more people in 2012 died of suicide in the military than of combat or transport accidents. And so we look at that and say, oh my God, those wars are horrible. A full third of them had never been deployed. Another third only deployed once. And so what we're seeing is, and it wasn't that the military was so lethal, it was that it used to be protective. It used to be people lived in barracks, and when communal living is protective against suicide. But it's not that way. Everybody's got their own little TV in their own little room now. And what they found from what they call sort of mental health autopsies, where you go around and you talk to people to find out what happened here, over 50%, well, over 60%, you were able to see a clear humiliation either at work or in a home life, or a clear loss of someone really important within 3 months. You make it out of the 3 months, and it doesn't happen again. When a celebrity takes their life, we see a spike, especially in people their age and gender. If you're a 50-year-old woman in an apartment by yourself feeling terrible and you think, no one cares, my kids are grown, think about another 50-year-old woman in a different apartment. You want her to kill herself? Why do you value her? Well, you're important too. And that means that just by resisting suicide, you're doing a mitzvah. You're doing a service. And I am willing to be the person to thank you. And I bet you're in this room. There's so many people who flash on suicide. Well, you all flash on homicide, at least when you're driving, right? You want to kill that guy? But you don't think that's information I now need to factor into how I live, right? You know that's wrong, you just... Suicide needs to be a similar, that's wrong, put it aside, both for other people's sake and for your own future self, which is an argument I found through history, that both of these arguments I found come up through history. And the society owes you gratitude for staying. You are saving some other mother's son just by staying. Thank you for staying. I'm not done. I just am thanking you for staying. It matters. We have an epidemic. 10 years ago, we hit 30,000 suicides a year, and it's at 40,000 now. A veteran kills himself almost once an hour, 22 a day, because they have guns. More than half the suicides in this country are with guns, and more than half of the gun deaths in this country are suicides. You just don't have the means in your house, and you'll survive your worst mood. Don't let your worst mood murder all your others. Write a note to yourself that you're happy so you can see it in your own handwriting when you're depressed. I hear from people who say they read the book and they put their guns someplace else. In England, they were having a rash of suicides by overdosing on acetaminophen, which burns your stomach. It's a terrible way to die. But they'd seen it on television. Somebody had done it in a TV show. And so they made a law that you have to sell Tylenol, acetaminophen in bubble packs in less a quantity than could kill you. Of course a person could go to 2 pharmacies and buy enough, but they don't. If we put barriers on bridges, of course people could go to another bridge, but they don't. Suicidal people have this one idea, they're miserable, but by the time they get to the bridge and see the fence, they are already moving out. They may even see human care in seeing that fence. But the real suicide rate went down in England. It also went down when they stopped having, Sylvia Plath put her head in the oven. They used to have a different gas system, and they changed it. And the real suicide rate went down because means matters so much, because it's impulsive in so many cases. By the way, when I say I'm against suicide, I am mostly talking about if you know that not one person you know would agree that this was a good idea. And I think that we know that feeling of wanting to do it anyway. Even you yourself in another mood would disagree with it, then don't do it. If you're in either mental or physical health that you know that somebody, a doctor, a friend, a loved one might say, okay, this is a different situation, maybe, even if one person says, maybe you've had enough, I say that has to be adjudicated separately from my argument. But I've heard from a lot of people who are disabled or fatally ill, and they say they need the book because they get the feeling that they're a burden. And, you know, there's a group called Not Dead Yet. They have a right to be alive and to care about life. Burden is one of the biggest things in suicide notes. Check. See if you're a burden or if it would be a much bigger burden if you took your life, right? We're in this together. And the more we admit our pain, the less painful it is. We have to come together in that way. But it was really important to me. It was because people were asking me these questions that made me think about the stay argument, and because of my work and my writing, and because of losses in my real life, and because of dark times of my own where I've envisioned it. They call it ideational, right? Where you just think of it, whether you're not making a plan, but it's in your head. And the idea of realizing that I think 85, 90% of people I talk to sometimes think about it or have thought about it. And we ask high school students, more than half of high school students have already thought of it. College students, graduate students, a lot of them have even made plans but not done it. So it's more common. The more we realize it's common, the more we can protect against it and realize that that thought doesn't mean maybe you should do it. But so I came up with it and wrote it in a very organic situation, answering that need. But then I was certainly aware that here secularism could make a moral, progressive statement. We think in this culture, secularists tend to be, hey, if there's no God, it's all you. And that's not a very safe thing to tell people, because it's not all you. We love you. We care. And we care about each other. And it's better to tell people, no, you may not. And if they get to another place, they can piece that together. But we shouldn't be telling college students, look, existentialism, because even Camus said, don't do it. More life is always worth it, even if it's horrible. He said it's experience. He said there's no life that's better than another life, all experience. But unlike all the other philosophers say it doesn't matter how long you're on Earth if you consider the eternity on one side and the eternity on the other. But Camus says it does matter. Sartre is the one person who says, go ahead and kill yourself. And he was one depressed Frenchman. I mean, we're going to teach our children from him? You know, and this is a guy who went through the period of the Nazis and the Holocaust. He'd gone through World War I, II. He's a very dark figure. It is not the life-affirming. I believe that humanism supports the notion that we matter and that we can extend this mattering and loving. So I'm going to wrap up here, and we're going to and take questions. But what I'm seeing now is that what people have managed to come up with for weddings and funerals and baby ceremonies, which is to either cut out all the religion and just do a poem and a little ritual, or to do the classic traditional ritual because you like it. If you're an atheist, but if you feel good when you hear a song from the religion you grew up in, you can sing the song. I certainly know of non-believers who prefer it in Latin or Hebrew, so they're not actually saying, oh God, or the afterlife. But the point is, we don't have to throw it all out. I ask people what they miss about religion. They say things like certain foods. And I say, well, use that food at a ritual that matters to you. We have to fold the meaning back in. And they say they miss the singing, which is another thing we could fold back in, but we haven't. And all these things made me think about other things that religion used to do for us, like help us make decisions. Different religions did it in different ways. I remember George W. used to pray on it, right? What about secular people? Well, from a secular person's point of view, he's just making contact with his subconscious. He's figuring out what feels right, and so it works. But you have to schedule a time to think deeply, to be by yourself, to find ways to commune with your deeper self. And if you are encouraged towards the good by certain poems, or encouraged towards the good to yourself, that Mary Oliver poem that we just heard, I don't see where Kathy is, but she read it. There she is. She read Wild Geese. You know, that first line is, "You don't have to be good." It's used at a lot of weddings, and I think it's used at a lot of weddings in opposition to Paul's love is this, love is that. That's so demanding, and a lot of us get married even though we don't think of ourselves as grown-ups. We don't think of ourselves, a lot of people get married saying, well, I hope I can be monogamous. Well, I hope I can last forever. But so when you get married and you're willing to be scared and you don't have religion, you know, most old wedding vows, God was in the vow, he was marrying with you, he was overseeing it, he was witnessing the vow. That poem says all you have to do is let your animal body, your soft animal body, love what it loves. All you have to do is hear the geese overhead and know that you're part of the family of things. That poem is on that day where people are pledging. I mean, even the vows, we've retained a sort of archaic language and we say, I do. Do you ever ask questions where the answer is, I do? It's archaic because it feels liturgical, right? It feels like liturgy because it's old. But it is also, I think we can notice, a statement of action. I do. The whole wedding is a promise that is often something we haven't tried before, right? If it's your first marriage, you don't know if you've tried to be able to be what it takes to do this. And it's overwhelming. And that is why I think the Mary Oliver poem is so popular at weddings, where the couple is saying to each other, it's okay. We're still just the friends we were before. Usually there's one person who's more skittish than the other, and the calmer person will read that poem. The other really popular poem at weddings today is E. Cummings' I Carry Your Heart, I Carry It in My Heart. It repeats that beautiful line at the beginning and at the end. And in the middle, there's a lot of darkness. A lot of poems have darkness in it because a good poem is always ambivalent. That's what poems are. They try to tell the truth, and they're allowed to say different things. And so poetry has ambiguity in it. And people have trouble choosing a wedding poem because they don't want to say the dark things. And I tell them, just introduce it that way and say, this poem has both the darkness that we experience and the light. And we wanted to share that on our big day, that we recognize both, that we are able to cope with both being in our lives. But listen to that, I carry your heart, I carry it in your heart. It's sort of a replacement for the Adam's rib metaphor, which also used to be a text that we read at all weddings. It solved that question of randomness, that I just met this person or happened to live next to them. And in Judaism, it's the beshirt, the intended, the fated one. In Christianity, the idea that God brings these two people together. Well, what do you do in secularism to transform from random to what becomes the only reality there could be, right? How could I choose one person out of all this? And how could I live with anybody? But there's my love sleeping on the couch. How did he manage to get there? How did I get over all my fear of it and worry of it? A line like the story of Adam's rib made them flesh of flesh. It used to be random, now it is of necessity. You are one. And that E. Cummings poem, I Carry Your Heart in My Heart, is both a statement of you soothe me and also I am holding you. And it's, nearly as ubiquitous as these older biblical texts used to be. Keats is another one who thinks a great deal about ambiguity, contradiction, mystery. But he, except for a few poems in his very early juvenilia where he mentioned some angels, there's no spirits in those poems. Keats, he has a poem, "When I Have Fears That I May Cease to Be." We use that as its title. Because he had tuberculosis. He had nursed his mother through tuberculosis and into the grave. Then his brother started spitting blood on white handkerchiefs, and he too died. And now Keats, he's under 30, he's in his 20s, and he's now spitting red blood on white handkerchiefs. He knows what that means. So when he says, "When I have fears that I may cease to be," he describes missing what he could have written and the love he could have experienced. The poem ends, "Then I go down to the shore to think, till love and fame to nothingness do sink." Because he knew he could go to the ocean and get that big feeling, change perspectives by seeing all the stars, by seeing the hugeness of the ocean, by realizing that we are all here only for a kind of moment. And he soothed himself by nature, by the beauty of nature, the grandeur, the otherworldliness of it. And we get not just the ocean, but Keats's poem. And that's the other beauty, that we can add, as Whitman says, that we can add a line, that the great story of culture goes on, and that we can add a line. So there are coming of age rituals. I think there's a Bukowski poem that is so gorgeous, and maybe it's not for everyone, but I'm going to read it to you real quickly. "Your life is your life. Don't let it be clubbed into dank submission. Be on the watch. There are ways out. There is light somewhere. It may not be much light, but it beats the darkness. Be on the watch. The gods will offer you chances. Know them. Take them. You can't beat death, but you can beat death in life sometimes. And the more often you learn to do it, the more light there will be. Your life is your life. Know it while you have it. You are marvelous. The gods await to delight in you." The ability to have words that sing, that we can memorize and that come back, that we can use on ritual after ritual, that we can make a canon of poetry that does what religion does, is what I think we need to work on. We need to see a future where we take what we love from the religious culture, where we take what we believe, and we add it to the artistic and humanistic world and find the meaning that's already there for us, that we can lean back into. And it's going to take work of figuring out what moves us. And it's going to take work of excavating some rituals from religion, ring exchanges for promises, or just going to a certain location at a certain time to make your decision. But bring your decision poem, and how to find a decision poem, and things like this. The idea of thinking in an aggressive, forward, proactive way about how to mark our seasons and mark the seasons of life, how to celebrate, how to mourn. We can't just leave all of it behind. And because so many atheists have been angry at religion, we've just had these two camps. And there's a huge overlap. And we need to start thinking about it. Thanks so much.